to the Power of One. Today, I am super excited to speak with a dynamic advocate. I remember the first day I met this young lady, she was speaking and the passion was just pouring out through her pores. And I asked someone that I work with, I said, who is that young lady? And they said, that's Movita. You haven't met Movita? I said, no, please introduce me to her. I think Movita is just a dynamic advocate, but most importantly, she has a warm spirit and she's just a beautiful, beautiful person. Welcome to the show, Movita. Movita, you have had many, many tragedies in your life. And I recently saw your documentary, Murders That Matter. And I just want to tell you, I love you for you. You're unapologetic. You are a hell of an advocate, and you are you 24/7. And I just want to say I appreciate that. I also want to say that I admire your strength. You had two children who passed away to gun violence, and your father, correct?
Yeah, so first let me say, don't make me cry in the beginning of the interview, Mel. I love you too. I am actually a 5-time co-victim of homicide.
Wow. Wow. To walk us through that timeline, please.
Yeah, so Easter Sunday, March 30th, 1975, I was 8 years old. My father was shot and killed in front of my family. July 1st, 1991, my only brother was murdered in a domestic violence incident. January 13th, 2011, my 18-year-old son, Charles Johnson, came to Philadelphia to pick up his sister, and two boys walked up to the car. I had just bought my daughter and put 4 bullets in my son because they thought he was someone else. He was my baby of 4 children. I left Philadelphia January 15, 2008 to get away from the gun violence to protect my children. I buried my son exactly 3 years to the day that I left on January 15th, 2011. 2 years later, my first cousin's only child, he was the 5th, he lived down the street from us. He was the 5th child in my house because he liked the craziness of the 4 kids in my house. And there was always a plate of dinner at my table for him. Stephen Kyrie Johnson was about to graduate Fox Temple School of Business with his bachelor's degree. He went to a New Year's party on Temple's campus that he didn't even want to go to. 2 boys got into an altercation over a girl. He was trying to be the peacemaker. 1 boy turned around, put a gun to his chest, and pulled the trigger. And my 30-year-old son, Dante, who stood on the front line of the gun violence issue with his mother for a decade after his brother and best friend was murdered, went to California for a weekend trip. And on March 5th, someone ran into a strip mall, just shooting because there was a crowd of people. 6 people were shot. My son, my last surviving son, was the only fatality.
Well, Vita, how are you still standing?
Only by faith. Only by faith.
When did you make the decision that I'm going to advocate for those affected by gun violence?
So, Melanie, I don't even think I ever made that decision. I think it happened very naturally and very organically, right? When Charles was murdered in 2011, he was engaged to be married. He had a baby on the way. His fiance was 8 months pregnant. My son worked at 18 years old. He worked to take care of over 100 chronically mentally ill adults every day. Mm-hmm. Right. My family has always been in the business of helping. I'm a social worker by trade and training, and I've raised my children to be compassionate and to take care of people. And when Charles was murdered, I couldn't stay in the fetal position in bed because not only did I have his child on the way, but my daughter, who he came to pick up, was 7 months pregnant. She then developed survivor's remorse. She literally developed unmanageable hypertension right after we buried Charles. I know that was associated with her trauma. So I had to live. I had 3 surviving children. I had 2 grandchildren on the way, not even here yet. And we had an entire community, right? Because me and my children are so popular in this city. You know, a group of young men, the morning Charles died, showed up on my front porch, my 150-foot front lawn in Lansdowne, Pennsylvania, with bags, and I knew their intent, right? They wanted to retaliate. And at that point, I said, not in my son's name. So I realized in that moment, we had to be the visual that they saw on how to handle the issue of Charles being murdered, right? And then what happened was, very organically, less than 30 days after I buried my son, people started calling me and my husband's phone. And people were saying by word of mouth, when people got shot, you got to call Yancey and Movita, they'll help you. And we did. We were getting calls. We started showing up at crime scenes. We started showing up at the hospital. We were literally packing up boxes of food and taking them to families' houses. When we would go in a house and the lights were out, we would get the lights turned on. We started burying people's children because people weren't prepared. They didn't have life insurance. And very organically, less than 30 days after Charles died, the Charles Foundation formed.
Okay.
And Charles is an acronym for Creating Healthy Alternatives Results in Less Emotional Suffering. And the irony behind that, Mel, is I don't even remember doing it. In my insanity, I don't even remember doing it. I know the date that it was formed because of the date on the legal documents, you know, but I never even really made the decision. It just happened.
See, I mean, you were born to touch the lives of others. That journey, though, has been heartbreaking and just unbelievable. And in my opening, I said I remember the day that I met you. It's not too many times. I have a horrible memory and I can't remember anybody's name, but I remember you speaking at the district attorney's office, and I'm staring at, I'm like, this powerful sister. It's like, you don't know Movita? I said, no, but I need you to introduce me to her. See, the thing about me, and I think you know this, and other sisters know this about me, I'm not intimidated by a powerful Black sister. I want to be associated with you because you're going to help me grow. And on those days, when you have those days that you can't fight, then that's when I want you to lean on me, so then that way I can uplift you. You have done an amazing job in the city of Philadelphia, and I take my hat off to you. And you know we are connected for life. So no matter where you run to, I'm gonna be right. I just want you to know that. So tell me something, Movita, when you got into the victim services world in Philadelphia, were you shocked to find out some things? And did you say, okay, now that I am here, let me see what's broken so that I can continue to help more people?
Absolutely, Mel. Even from the inception of creating the Charles Foundation, right? Because my son was murdered at Washington Lane in Musgrave. Now, mind you, I'm from West Philly, 5 generations. I raised my children in Southwest. I moved to Lansdowne. I'm running a facility, a 144-bed facility for people with mental illness, because I was a master for the state of Pennsylvania. I'm running a facility at 6200 Artley Street. My son is murdered down the street from that facility, right? And what I found was, in my mind, I said, they've taken my son. They won't take anything else from me. Like, even changing my path on how I got to that facility. I drove past the spot where my son was murdered every day. Because I said they won't take anything. I mean, that's illogical, but that's how I thought at the time. So when Charles was murdered, I said, when I parked on Strawberry Mansion Drive, and in my mind, I wanted to drive my car off of the bridge.
Mm.
because the pain was so great. I said I had to
Mhm.
do something, right? Because I got these two grandchildren that need me, and I got my surviving children, and we got a whole community. And at that point, I began to reach out to victim service organizations, traditional grief support group,
Mhm.
which I didn't know what to expect because I had never been to anything like that. And to tell you the truth, nobody reached out to me. So I
Mm.
began reaching out, and I called one organization, and we're going on 12 years later. They still haven't called me back. And then the other organization, I started going to these groups, Mel, and I would leave physically sick. I would go outside and vomit. And what I found was that every time that I sat in this particular group, I was being re-traumatized over
Mm.
and
Mm.
over and over, because all we did in these groups was talk about the night of the homicide, right?
Mhm.
We didn't
Mhm.
talk about healing. We didn't talk about how to move beyond. We didn't talk about what we needed to do in order to not just care for our families and our communities, but to care for ourselves and
Mm.
learn how to live with the grief. So what I did was at the Charles Foundation, I coined a term called survivors empowerment.
Mm.
And we did not have traditional grief support at the Charles
Okay.
Foundation. We had survivors empowerment groups.
Okay.
And one of the first rules that we created was that you do not relive the homicide in this group.
Okay.
We talk about the pain. We talk about surviving the pain. We talk about what we need to survive the pain. We talk about becoming active. We talk about becoming the voice for the voiceless. We talk about becoming politically active to change the
Mm.
homicide rate, right? And what I found was that I had been asked to participate in a gun violence strategy that worked here in Philadelphia, and no one would fund it. Right. So I got into the victim services realm through the Charles Foundation. And then I wound up fighting for this strategy, and I ran for office in 2016. And I didn't run for office because I wanted to be a politician. Right.
Okay.
I ran
Okay.
for office because I wanted to protect people on both sides of the gun. Because by this time, I understood that the problem was so much larger than the gun, that the problem was actually structural in this
Okay.
society,
Okay.
right? That it was about the social determinants that lead to community violence, at the top of the list of which is poverty.
That's
So
right.
I didn't win that race, but I wound up being tapped by District Attorney Larry Krasner, and I
Mhm.
went into the District Attorney's office as the supervisor for victim witnesses services and restorative justice.
And what you did an excellent job. And you sit in such a unique position because you were a victim of gun violence. You were a co-homicide survivor, but then you also started to begin to understand the victim services and how it was structured in the city of Philadelphia. Now, having both of those experiences are just unbelievable, because most of us in the victim services world do not. We're going to talk about the birth of CARES in 1 second, but was any of the shooters apprehended from any of the homicides in your family?
Yeah, so for Charles, the two young men were caught. And I went through a 2-week trial in February of 2013 with these two young men. And I actually had a spiritual awakening during the trial. And, hearing about how these young men were raised, they were from Germantown, they were products of their environment. I literally asked for mercy when it came to the sentencing. And I asked my family that. I think it may have been maybe 3 days before the end of the trial. And my heart began to soften. And I called the family meeting, and I told my family I wanted to ask for mercy, and they were not in favor, but they supported it because I asked them to. And when I had my opportunity to do my victim impact statement, you've gone to court with enough people to know what
Yes.
that
Yes.
is.
Yes.
When I had the opportunity to do my victim impact statement, I actually asked the judge for mercy for the two young men that murdered my son. And the one young man, got life without the possibility of parole. And the second young man, the judge was going to give him 24 to 40 years plus 2 gun charges. But because of my plea, she literally cut his sentence in half, more than in half. Instead of giving him 24 to 40, she gave him 12 to 24. And she actually dropped both of the gun charges. And that young man just paroled in March.
Okay. So the criminal justice process for you, was that re-traumatizing?
Oh, it absolutely was. Right from the moment that I was notified of how my son was, what happened with my son, I got to Einstein Hospital. He was in surgery. From the moment that the doctors told me, and so they came downstairs, and I'm just saying over and over again, I want to see my son, right? Take me to my son. And they're talking and I can't hear them, but I hear when the doctor says, Mrs. Harrell, your son didn't make it. Right. And that wasn't even what triggered me. What triggered me was I said, please take me to see my son. And when he said to me, we have to clean him up first, that triggered me. Right. Because now I got all these visuals in my head of my baby in surgery. And we have to clean him up first. But not only that, even the engagement with the homicide detectives, right? And it was like it just kept being insult to injury.
I hear you. Now, again, because Movita understood what it was to be a co-homicide survivor and how hard that is. And then Movita coming into the victim services world in the city of Philadelphia, she created the most dynamic program, which is CARES. And I've been on the victim services side for a little bit, but CARES was very unique, and it was not duplicatory services, which was extremely important because we do have many, many duplicatory services in the city of Philadelphia. But Movita, walk us through how CARES was born and what was the purpose of CARES?
So CARES was a direct result of my experience from my son being murdered. Period. Right. So CARES actually started when Charles was murdered, because when those people in the community started calling us and we would show up, that's exactly what CARES was. We would show up, we would support the families, we would take them where they needed to go, and we would support them as long as they needed us to. So the caveat, because I'm a social worker by trade and training, and the one thing that I understand is that care planning starts at the initial contact. Right. And so when I put CARES down on a piece of paper, and all it was things that I was doing already. It wasn't like I had this epiphany one day and said, oh, I'm going to create this model. Right. All I did was write down what I did after my son was murdered, showing up to the scene, going to the family's house, supporting the family, making sure they had food in the house, making sure the children had the supports that they need, making sure that they could bury their family member, making sure they were connected to other resources. That's all CARE was, right? Mm-hmm. So through an amazing $500,000 grant, we were able to literally take CARES and turn it into a model. And what happened was when I went into the DA's office, District Attorney Larry Krasner was fully in favor of me bringing the model into the District Attorney's office. And I could think of no other way, Mel, that we could cement that model in Philadelphia than to have it sit in the District Attorney's office. Right?
And that was an
number one, we knew that it would get the proper supports that it needed to be successful, and that it would continue to receive the necessary resources that it needed to be successful, right? But what I did was, because I knew that there were other victim services, because I'm in the DA's office now, and there's these victim services organizations around the city, and I don't like to create, an atmosphere of competition.
That's right.
So what I wanted to do was make it so that these care crisis responders, who are people who have been directly directly impacted by homicide, I just put a call out to all the people I knew who had credibility in the hood, who had lost someone to gun violence. Those became our peer crisis responders that we were able to pay $15 an hour just to support a family for the first 45 days after that homicide occurred, right? But then the other caveat was we got all of these amazing organizations around Philadelphia, like Northwestern Victim Services, like Center City Victim Services, like Southwest Victim Services. That CARES responder would connect that family and the community that they live in to that resource in the community that they live in.
Yes.
They ain't got to go downtown if they live in Southwest. They ain't got to go to West Philly if they live in Northwest. They got the resources and the supports that they need in their own community.
And it's a beautiful, beautiful model. And you have always been doing amazing things. So you have a documentary out, Murders That Matter, and you also have a book. Tell the viewers about the documentary and then tell them about the book and where they can purchase the book.
Yes. So the documentary is really funny. So when I ran in 2016, and I didn't really want to win, I just wanted money for the GVI strategy. So for people who don't know, GVI is group violence intervention. And we did it here in Philadelphia in 2013, 2014. It was called the Focused Deterrence Strategy. And we did it with a severely underfunded budget. We got $150,000 for 2 years, which was one person's salary for 2 years. But even in a severely underfunded budget, we had a 50% reduction in gun violence in the first year of the strategy. It was very highly successful, but guess what? Nobody would fund it. And we'll have another show later to talk about the big business of homicide and why nobody would fund it, right? Okay. But nobody would fund it. I went in front of politicians. Nobody would fund it. So I went on the process, the adventure of spending the next 7 years of my life getting it funded. And the first time I ran, it was because I wanted somebody to fund GVI. It was a door out for the top 3% who shoot. It provided social services. It was a social service driven model. It gave them jobs, training, education, Pampers, milk, money to turn on your light bill, housing. It was a social service driven model, but it was a positive peer pressure model. So when I ran in 2016, there was a filmmaker who was teaching at New York University who had already been a filmmaker creating some amazing documentaries. He was in a coffee shop, opened up the New York Times, and there was an article about mother of slain son runs for office to save people on both sides of the gun. So he found my phone number. He reached out to me. He asked me, could he come to Philly for breakfast? And he's originally a Philadelphian, by the way. He's from West Philly. He lost an aunt and a cousin to gun violence, right? So he came to Philadelphia. We had breakfast. He called me back the following week. He said, Movita, I'd like to come in and follow you for your election. And I'm like, I don't think my life is that deep, but okay, if you want to. So he moved to Philadelphia, which was supposed to be for 6 months. He followed me through that campaign that I did not win. But then he commits to following me for the next 6 years of my life, Mel.
Wow.
So Marco followed me for 6 years. The documentary premiered on October 2nd. It has already gotten acclaims from the Sundance Film Festival. PBS picked it up exclusively. They wanted to premiere it and air it exclusively. So people can go to pbs.org, and up until November 30th, Murders That Matter is free to the public. And he literally documents my journey from 2016 to 2019, to 2020, in trying to save communities on both sides of the gun.
Okay, then tell us about your book.
My book is Phoenix Ascending, My Rise from the Ashes. And I think one thing that I didn't share is that I am a person in recovery. I picked up my first drug the night that my father was murdered, which was a glass of alcohol. I was 8 years old. And I spent the next 20 years of my life in an active addiction. I came through the crack era. And I began writing this book, Mel. You probably don't know this, in 1992.
Oh, wow.
And for me, I was still in an active addiction, and it was a form of therapy for me. And I wound up getting clean 2 years later in 1994. My clean date is September 15th, 1994. But something in the back of my head in 1992 said that someday somebody's going to need to read this for hope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So what I did was I just started writing from my earliest memory, which is about 4 years old, in domestic violence. And I just kept writing and writing. And when I got clean, I took very few things besides my children, but I grabbed that book. I had composition books and I
Okay.
took them with me wherever I went. And I just kept adding to it over the years. And when I came home from jail, because I was indicted in 2019 for quote unquote corruption. When I came home, my son Dante pressed me to finish my book. And I finished my book, and it actually launched on September 20th, 2021, which would have been my son Charles's 29th birthday. Within 5 hours, it became an Amazon #1 bestseller.
Okay.
Um, and it's Phoenix Ascending, My Rise from the Ashes. It can be found on Amazon. And what I had to do, and the book is about 335 pages, but
Okay.
it is a memoir of my life experience. And it is primarily about human resilience, right? And how
Okay.
we all have what's inside of us to be able to navigate this life and survive this life, right? And I don't think you know, I'm actually going to launch the other half of the book on April 30th, which would have been my son Dante's birthday.
Okay.
And that is Phoenix Ascending Inferno.
Any viewers who are watching this, if you want to connect with someone who is genuine and someone who will love on you without no judgment, you better seek out Movita Johnson-Harrell. Support her in her documentary, and please go out and purchase her book. Movita, I love you.
I love you too, Mel. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining me today. It is extremely important for you to find your purpose and your passion in life. Find out something that makes you happy, or find something where you say to yourself, I have to fight for this cause, and make your voice heard. It is extremely important. You're not doing it for you, you're doing it for those in need. Peace and love. And remember, the power of one starts with you.